My name is Sean Van Diver. I'm a Navy veteran from San Diego, and I'm the president of the AfghanEvac Coalition. AfghanEvac is three things. It's an organization, it's a coalition, and it's a movement. There are a few takeaways today before we dive right in that I want you to focus on. One, there is a recipe for success. You can make change by being involved in your community, whatever that looks like, be it global, like AfghanEvac, or be it local, like I live in San Diego, and maybe I care to get a stop sign put in my neighborhood. Civic engagement is the pathway to making the change that you want to see in the world. Before we get started, AfghanEvac focuses on three main things. One, reducing uncertainty. Our job is to make sure that the people on the other end of the world who are trying to get to their American dream know as much as they possibly can, and they are certain about what is going to happen with them. Two, faster and more. We want to make sure that we're getting people as quickly as possible through the complicated systems that we have for folks getting here. And three, maintaining urgency. So sometimes we have to dial it up a little bit, and sometimes we keep it pretty calm. That's what the organization does. The organization also administers several programs, including a coalition of member organizations that do everything from providing aid on the ground, case management, legal and immigration aid, resettlement assistance. And our members of the coalition are from all across the American experience. We have veterans and lawyers and teachers. We've got a children's book illustrator. We've got retired grandmothers. The movement is bigger than the organization or the coalition. The movement represents the entire ecosystem of individual organizations in and out of government who are working to keep the promise to our wartime allies. It's worth noting that our coalition came about just 8 months after January 6th, at our most divided time in our country. And what we saw in August of 2021 was a broad coalition of diverse folks coming together with a common goal.
America's longest war.
Thunderous explosions and the rattle of anti-aircraft fire.
2 decades of brutal conflict in Afghanistan.
Tango 3, Tango 3.
Fought by coalition forces and thousands of Afghan nationals, all driven by the promise of a brighter tomorrow.
Ever since the American military has been in the country in Afghanistan, especially in this area, these people feel like they have got a new life.
From interpreters to embassy staff, journalists to aid workers, hundreds of thousands of Afghans stood shana bashana, or shoulder to shoulder, with U.S. service members and frontline civilians.
They conduct security patrols on foot to deny the enemy a secure pathway through these mountains.
Their faithful service earning an opportunity to pursue their American dream. Despite bipartisan support from those here in the U.S., many Afghan allies faced bureaucratic nightmares trying to navigate the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa, or SIV program, a lifeline thrown by Congress in 2009, which gave eligible Afghans a pathway to U.S. citizenship, but became tangled in delays and inefficiency.
Chaotic and tragic end to America's longest war.
As the Taliban swiftly reclaimed Afghanistan in August 2021, the world watched in horror.
Thousands of Afghans stormed the Kabul airport.
For our allies, the hope of safety and freedom in America seemed to disappear in a matter of weeks.
It's about our obligation in the world.
Breaking a promise, however, was not an option for the ordinary Americans who rallied. Veterans, diplomats, faith-based organizations, and aid workers forging partnerships to resettle the 70,000 Afghan newcomers who arrived in the wake of the Kabul airlift. One of history's greatest examples of global civic engagement was unfolding right before our eyes. It's how AfghanEvac and its deep partnership with the U.S. government was born.
I have never seen a partnership with government that works like this one works.
Today, these Afghan allies are new Americans, rebuilding their lives and enriching our communities. But the mission continues, and the effort to support the ones who for so long supported us is far from over. The State Department's Office of the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts, or CARE, and groups like AfghanEvac work tirelessly to ensure we keep the promises we made to our wartime allies.
Morning!
This story of partnership and collaboration is proof that civic engagement can change the world. It is a call to action, reminding us of the enduring bonds formed in the quest for freedom and the imperative to uphold America's promises. Together, government and non-government partners are doing just that for our Afghan allies, and that can only be done Shana Bashana.
We're going to get into the intros here quickly. As you heard earlier, my name's Sean. We're going to quickly go over to Mara Tekaj.
Yes, Mara Tekaj. I am the coordinator for Afghan relocation efforts at the State Department, affectionately known as CARE. We are the centerpiece of a broad U.S. government effort to relocate and resettle Afghan allies. We are responding to the American public, veterans, serving military, government officials, diplomats, non-government organizations, and journalists who desire to keep our promise to Afghan allies who stood by us for 20 years.
Thank you, Mara. Next up, we have Curtis Reed.
Thank you, Sean. My name is Curtis Reed. I'm the Chief of Staff at the National Security Council, and prior to this role, I was the President's Special Advisor for Afghan resettlement. And in that role, we kind of took this from what was initially an emergency effort under what we called then Operation Allies Welcome, where we moved more than 60,000 Afghans onto our bases in the U.S., bases overseas as well. And then we have taken that and turned it into something called Enduring Welcome, which we have established through our partnership with AfghanEvac. And my role in that has been to coordinate the U.S. government's agencies in standing up a multi-year, long-term, resilient resettlement program for our Afghan allies.
Thank you, Curtis. Now over to Lila Kostani.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lila Kovastani. First off, thank you so much for being here. I feel like there is so much going on at South by Southwest, so I know that there are other places you could be, so thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon. I'm an Afghan refugee of the Soviet War, so I came here in 1982 with my family. I'm also a U.S. Navy veteran. I spent multiple deployments in Afghanistan alongside U.S. and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Special Operations Forces. And I'm also the CEO of a nonprofit called Honor the Promise, which is part of the AfghanEvac Coalition. And our nonprofit focuses on supporting our Afghan military special operations allies that are now in the U.S. So those Afghans that were trained by our U.S. Navy SEALs, by our Green Berets, by our Rangers. And so before we get started, we would like to know a little bit more about you all. So how many of you identify as Afghan? Okay. How many of you identify as a veteran or a military family member? Okay. And how many of you or someone that you know was involved in this effort to help bring Afghans to the United States? Okay, thank you.
Look at that.
Yeah, look at that.
We have lapel pins for all of you.
Yes, please come get them from Sean afterwards. So the reason I ask those questions is because Sean mentioned there's a recipe for success when you're trying to work on civic engagement. And it really starts with all of us. It starts with people. So we talk about people, processes, and partnerships. So with people are paramount. Because if you have the right kinds of people, a mix of different kinds of people, you can build and then sustain a movement. And then we talk a lot about processes. Some of it can be a little bit dry and stale, but it's important because process is pivotal. If you are co-designing processes that actually support the communities that are the most impacted by a problem, then you can move mountains. And then the last piece is partnerships, because with partnerships, you're better, you're faster, you're stronger, you're more resilient, and you're more resourced. So those have been the keys to our success: people, process, partnerships, and that's what we've relied on from the beginning.
That's right. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about our origin story. In August of 2015, I got a text message from my buddy Lucky, and he said, "Brother, I'm stuck on this mountain in Irgun, 8 hours outside of Kabul. I think I'm gonna die. We're surrounded by the Taliban. We're running out of ammunition. Will you grant my last wish and get my family back to San Diego? And I, of course, said, I'll do whatever I can, my friend. And Lucky's not the only, I'm not the only person that got such a text message, right, Layla?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many veterans who had spent time, of course, deployed in Afghanistan, members of the Afghan diaspora, so those Afghans that had already been in the United States for several decades, were getting text messages and pleas for help. For me, I make no qualms about it. I was very focused on getting Afghan women and girls out of Afghanistan because I knew the fate that would befall them. My family had lived under the Taliban in the 1990s, so I was terrified of what happened to those women and girls. And then I think I expected to hear from the Afghans that I had worked with or that colleagues had worked with in Afghanistan. But what I didn't expect was to start hearing from like my high school friends and college friends and my neighbors down the road that were saying, how do we help? How do we support? And to me, it felt like there were really two types of people that got involved. There were people that knew Afghans and were trying to get very specific Afghans or groups of Afghans to the US. And then there were people that frankly might not have been able to find Afghanistan on a map, but they really wanted to help support because there was this humanitarian crisis and they just felt compelled to make some change. And so as time went on and more of us were getting these messages and the desperation grew, we saw a lot of people getting involved.
Absolutely, and this is really something that we experience within government as well. Since the early days of the evacuation in August, both in the White House but across the broader federal government, we too were inundated with text messages, emails. You can think of the thousands of people across the government that served in Afghanistan during our 20-year presence there. It ranges from diplomats to development professionals, civilians from the Department of Defense, and our colleagues in uniform. So while this was something the president directed early on, that we had to do everything we could across the government to make good on our promise to our Afghan allies, it was something that people within the government felt really deeply as well, because many of them had personal experiences with their translators, their staff at the embassy or throughout the provinces in Afghanistan.
So I got that call from Lucky. I was running around frantically, just like thousands of others were running around frantically. There were 25 chats that we were in, and I come from an emergency management background and an anti-terrorism background from when I was in the Navy. And I knew that a few things were true. I knew that people would try to take advantage of these folks. I knew that if they didn't coordinate, all these well-intentioned folks might get somebody killed. And I knew that we wanted to make sure that we could feel good about this thing that we were standing up to do, and we couldn't do that if we had gotten somebody hurt. So I was working at Deloitte at the time, and I did what any good management consultant would do. I set up a sync call. And those happened at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. every day. And the first one was 7 groups, No One Left Behind, Team America Relief. Some of the groups just didn't have names yet, but Human Rights First was there, a cross-section of folks, and almost to a person, everybody that was in that first meeting is still involved today. And so our first section that we're going to talk about is people. These extraordinary people who put their lives on hold for what they thought was going to be 2 weeks in August and stepped up. But this partnership that we have with the federal government didn't just happen. They weren't talking to us in August. We didn't have this relationship set up. So I've been described as conflict forward sometimes. And I decided that we needed to take a seat at the table. So I'd heard that there was going to be a meeting. I got on a plane from San Diego and I flew out to Washington, D.C. And through one of the organizations that was in our coalition, that was now 50 by the end of August, I got into a prep meeting for a meeting that was happening with the Pentagon. And who should I find but Lila Koastani, who I'd known for probably 7 years at that point. And I knew that it was going to be okay then, right? I knew that seeing Lila there meant that there were smart people in the room, and I think Lila probably has some thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the people aspect, you need people who sometimes feel like opposites to come together to work on a really challenging problem. So we had people who, of course, identified as veterans, people who identified as diplomats, but we had people who, again, had really no experience with Afghanistan. But that was great, because you had people who had this depth of knowledge, and then people who had very fresh perspectives about how to solve this problem. You had folks like me who had really deep emotional ties to what was going on. And then you also had people that could almost act like a Vulcan and just be very logical about what was happening. If you don't know what a Vulcan is, shame on you. Go watch Star Trek, I beg you. You had people that were fueled by this personal passion that they burned really brightly for a short amount of time, but that was important because they got the momentum going. And then you had people that were already starting to look towards like a long-term view, like this is a multi-year problem. Like, what are we going to do about this? And you need somebody who's Sean, who's a bull in a china shop, who is conflict forward, and then you need people who are just sort of willing to roll their sleeves up and go off of a to-do checklist. These are the things that we need to get done. And so I really think that was our strength.
Absolutely.
And I think part of why government was willing to talk to us is because we had veterans and we had Afghans in the mix. So we were from the beginning listening to the voices of the people that were really impacted by the situation.
And in that room that we talked our way into, the AfghanEvac partnership with the State Department was born, and it was kind of a contentious room. It was a 3-hour meeting. But by the end of that, State Department had agreed to go to our regular sync calls, go to a data consolidation meeting. We were trying to make sure that everybody who was sending names and in this frantic effort to get people out, they were sending in the same format, right? So it was easier for state. We wanted to quiet the chaos. And so, and then we started the partnership that week, and we have 400 pages of notes from all of our meetings. So good times.
But you're talking about, the most important thing about what both you're talking about is the secret sauce, which is really people. And we were dealing with a groundswell of engagement and desire to try to help Afghans. It was coming from all directions, and it was very focused and intense. And so these people were deeply committed Americans wanting to help Afghan allies. And we asked ourselves, how can we integrate civil society into our operation in the government, as Sean was mentioning? So early on, CARE brought in people from civil society. March Bishop joined as a liaison. Jessica Bradley Rushing came and joined. Chuck Rush. We had a number of people coming straight from civil society and NGOs that helped us do our job better. How? They gave us direct input, and they helped us become more agile. So with that combination of civil society working with government, we were able to shape a longer-term effort. What did we do? We talked to each other, frankly, openly. We were prepared to be accountable. And sometimes we had some very uncomfortable conversations.
Conflict forward.
Yes.
Unhappy conversations. But we knew the value of these hard conversations, and so we evolved as a result of this. We knew that the benefit was going to be to evolve. Our operations improved, we expanded, and we became more efficient. And this was the benefit of civil society input. We were also lucky and smart enough to bring in Afghans and Afghan Americans onto our team. They brought insight and perspective that only they could bring to the table, particularly cultural perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, just the other week, we were in a meeting following a trip out to several of the locations where Afghans get ready to come here. And what we'd heard was that there's a lot of questions around what to expect. So AfghanEvac and CARE got together and we said, well, how can we fix that? We're going to create a pre-relocation toolkit. And so some consultants and AfghanEvac and state folks all got together. They made a list of all the things you should bring, you shouldn't bring, other important things you might need to know. And on that list was prescription medications. Well, Abdul, one of the Afghans on the team, goes, there's no word in Dari for prescription. We just go get our medicine at the store. Nobody needs to tell us we can get it. So oh, okay. And that made it less confusing, right? We work on reducing uncertainty faster and more and maintaining urgency. So that was one of those things that we did. And Merit, I know CARE has been very intentional. We've been very intentional. We wanted to bring people of all walks of life, of all the most impacted, most vulnerable people, and make sure that they're not only involved in our organization, they're not only at the table, but they're leading in our organization. And that has worked out really, really well. Sort of pivoting to some of the cool experiences we've had, it's not just Curtis and Mara that ask us, hey, what should we do about Afghanistan? In August of 2022, Lila and I both got a phone call from President Biden himself to ask us that. Lila, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So it's a pretty surreal experience to be an Afghan refugee and a veteran and get a phone call from a president. I don't care which president, it's an honor, okay? Any president calls you, it's an honor. And I remember very pointedly asking for three things. So this was a year post withdrawal, and the online applications for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services were only available in English. And I was like, that's a huge burden on the applicant. And frankly, it slows down the process because they're always coming to the Afghan diaspora and they're coming to their veteran contacts and so on. So could we please get those changed? I asked for a public-private partnership to help find meaningful employment for our Afghan allies. And then the last one was I was really worried about predatory behavior towards our Afghans. So everything from people charging them tens of thousands of dollars to help them with their applications to become, citizens eventually, to even lending. And I'll be honest, I'm sure you can tell, that's like the thing that I'm known for at this point, is I was like, this isn't gonna go anywhere. Like, I just got a phone call and I think it was probably performative, and it's not gonna go anywhere. And within like 2 minutes, Curtis sent me a message and he was like, let's get on a phone call and talk more about what you just asked for.
And what Lila didn't know at the time was I was sitting on the other side of the Resolute desk listening to the conversation the president was having. And as soon as Sean and Layla had laid out their asks of the government, the president looked at me and said, Curtis, this is on you to go figure this out and to sort through the things they've asked for and make this program
I'm so
better.
sorry. I'm so sorry.
And look,
it was an honor.
I'll tell you, they followed through in remarkable ways. Everything the president said, that we would never have a problem with access to get what we needed. Like, these folks have followed through.
Yeah, and I think that really shows our level of commitment, at the White House to this common effort. But one thing that was so valuable to us in government early on, in terms of the partnership with AfghanEvac, is we had always wanted to have engagements with civil society, with Afghans, with veterans, to figure out what we needed to do better in terms of our relocation and resettlement efforts. But early on, it was an emergency operation, and we were working 18 hours a day to try to figure out how to move people from our bases overseas, resettle Afghans effectively in the United States to set them up for success. And so our time for outreach was pretty limited. And so yes, we would do Zooms with as many different people as we could think of, but the fact that AfghanEvac brought to us this coalition that included people from all parts of this effort, veterans, state and local government, different NGOs, meant that we had kind of a one-stop shop, one address, one partner to talk to about this work. And so I think that really enabled us to start to work towards a common mission, a shared goal. And I remember, I think it was about 3 days after I met Sean, we decided to, I think I got off of work at 9 that night, and we decided to meet up for a drink at the rooftop of the W Hotel across the street from the White House. And we got out, as all good plans are hatched, we got out a bar napkin and started writing down what
Probably should have saved that.
what this would look like, switching from an emergency operation into one that was a sustained and durable one over time. And what does right look like? What does it look like to make good on our commitment to our Afghan allies?
That moment was the first time somebody in government asked us, what does right look like? And it meant a lot. We've talked a little bit about people. Now we're going to talk about process. Process is really important, right? And this is people's lives on the line. We wanted to underscore, from day one, we wanted to underscore you shouldn't move somebody if you don't have a viable pathway for them. This is immigration law. You can't play with this. It's very serious. So we had to set up things that made it easy for us to ingest information in the same format and all of that. And I'm a millennial. I just use Google. Google Forms are our friend. They make fun of me because I love a Google form. Airtable, another friend. Google, Airtable, if you're listening, we love sponsorships. Help us out. In fact, every question that we've ever asked State Department, about 700 of them, has been submitted through Google Form. And that's constant communication is our mantra.
That's right, and from our side as well, we have to have constant communication to keep this sustainable. Whether it be the forms you love or the 700 questions you're sending our way, we have to keep up with you. So that means bi-weekly meetings. Every 2 weeks we are talking. We are talking constantly. In fact, when we realized we had to break news in real time to the whole coalition, we kind of just started talking, and we came up with our flash briefing mechanism. So whether it was whatever was coming up, we knew we had a key bit of news, one call to Sean, and momentarily, immediately, we had the whole coalition on the phone, and we could break whatever it was we needed to break to them.
Well, and look, I think that speaks a lot to the dedication of these folks that I have the privilege of working with, right? They would drop what they're doing, they would show up, and in another case, we had an issue in Pakistan, right? And so we created a form to take in information and identify when people were in crisis. And we called Mara. We asked for a flash briefing around this, and she did us one better. Why don't you tell us about the hotline?
So government is not always known for being the most nimble, right? So we had this issue. We had these issues facing us. We would talk about a lot of things, threats, like the one you're talking about in Pakistan, threats to families, threats to children. We would get together. We were really concerned. It was really bothering us. So we say, what can we do? Last year, the Pakistani government announced that it was going to start a deportation campaign against thousands of Afghan allies which were living there.
It was terrifying, Mara. It was terrifying for all of us. Afghans who had family members that had been waiting there for months, years. A lot of our folks are Afghan special operations folks. They just got on planes and left Afghanistan immediately, and their families had been left behind, right? So they're in Pakistan waiting, and now we're hearing from the Pakistanis that they're going to deport these folks. And for all of us as volunteers, we had no recourse. Like, what do we do? What do we say to these Afghans that are calling us in the middle of the night, wondering what's going to happen to them?
So we said, what are we going to do? These people are facing such a potential trauma, and who can they turn to? They're living in Pakistan. So we said, well, we have our own contact center with about 150, 200 people. They speak Dari, they speak Pashto. Oh, but they never did a hotline before. So we said, well, we're going to have to actually teach them to do a hotline, because that's what we decided we needed, was a hotline. So we pulled together, how are we going to make a hotline out of an organization that doesn't know how to do it? AfghanEvac. They gave us the input we needed to get the phones right, to get the messages right, to get the WhatsApps right. And when we got them wrong, they told us.
Conflict forward.
Right. And so that was how we did it.
Well, and what was so important about that piece was some folks maybe couldn't make a phone call, or maybe they could. Either way, you had two pathways. I'm a management consultant, right? Like, let's focus on user experience here. Some people maybe aren't able to make a phone call, so we had a hotline, we had a form, and things were cooking. Curtis, we've talked a lot about some pretty specific things, but we haven't explained SIV, we haven't explained the refugee process. Do you think you could walk us through some of that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think before I touch on that, though, I just have to interject that I think only when you work with the government is using Google Forms a huge innovation. So thank you for bringing that to us.
You guys can't even use Zoom at the White House.
Yeah. So I want to get a little wonky for a second and just talk about the two immigration pathways that we use to bring our Afghan allies to the United States. The first is the Special Immigrant Visa Program, and this is intended for Afghans that worked for the United States. So interpreters that worked for the US military, the local staff at our embassy and our various consulates across the country, Afghans that worked for DoD contractors. And then the refugee process is one that is for Afghans that worked with us or fought alongside us. So the special forces that Lila was mentioning, the female pilots from the Afghan Air Force, they come in under the refugee program. And the problem with both of these programs when we started this work is that neither one is fast. They are programs that were at the time taking years for applicants to complete. And that was, one, because kind of bureaucracy had layered up over time, but also in the case of the refugee program, people are often waiting in a third country where they are in relative safety, and we need to bring our Afghan allies out of harm's way quickly and into the United States. So let me just touch on the SIV program first, the Special Immigrant Visa Program. This is something that was created in 2009 by Congress, and it's something that has had bipartisan support for years, but like I mentioned, needed a bit of a retrofit. And we knew this even before the evacuation in August. Early during the administration, the president ordered a review of the entire SIV program to see how we could make it faster, how we could get our Afghan allies who had worked for us to the United States more quickly. And in doing that, we discovered some things that were kind of hallmarks of bureaucracy. We found one form that was 19 pages long, that was not required, and was only in English. As Lila mentioned, the only in English part was a real issue. So we got rid of it, and I think this is something that our Afghan allies really appreciated.
So I have a doctorate, and I couldn't figure out that form, so that should tell you everything you need to know. It's impossible.
Yeah. And another issue is that in order to qualify for the Special Immigrant Visa Program, you had to prove that you were employed by the US government. And this is something that would be really challenging. Say that you had worked for a DoD contractor in 2007, and in 2010, that DoD contractor ceased to exist. The firm closed. So who are you going to write to get your employment verification? And so the Department of Defense kind of reverse engineered this, and they figured out that they could use their records, their databases, in order to proactively push out these employment verification letters. And they did more than 12,000 of these, so it quickly benefited our Afghan allies. And then, on the refugee process, the issue here, as I mentioned, is this is one that was kind of never really sped up anywhere before in the world to meet an urgent need for relocation. And it was kind of one of these systems where you do one step and then you do the next step. It's a little bit chutes and ladders too.
Very linear.
What?
Very linear.
Very linear, yeah. But you could also kind of get sent back to go at different points. If you had a new baby, you had to figure out how to add the baby to your case, and that was a whole different process. If you had a physical, which is required for refugees coming to the US, it only is valid for a certain period of time. So if that expired before your case was done, there you go back to square one. And so what we have done is we have changed this from a process where you do each step consecutively to one at which you do them all at once. And this has sped up the process to make it go from something that previously took years to something that takes weeks or months. And this is something that has benefited not only Afghans. We're now using this at 12 sites around the world to process other refugees coming to the United States.
And that's a great segue into talking about partnerships, right? We've talked about people, we've talked about process. Curtis and the U.S. Digital Service and the White House team worked with civil society, and somebody in the room asked, why do you do it all at once? Why don't you just do it all at once? That's a great opportunity to talk about the importance of embracing expertise. Look, Jessica, who's in the audience right now, is a communications expert. But Judy, let me tell you about Judy, who's an SIV expert. You might think she's a State Department employee. You might think she's an immigration attorney. No, Judy's a grandma from Rochester, New York. She works with Keeping Our Promise. And Judy is very detail-oriented. I get emails from her all the time that help me understand the specific issues that are occurring with whatever the issue is of the day. And she brought to us several issues. So we knew she interacted with the NVC a lot, the National Visa Center, which is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we had an opportunity to go take a trip there, which was the culmination of, which acted as a culminating point for an effort that Jessica, who I mentioned earlier, led, but it was directed by the National Security Council. We approached the National Security Council based on information that Judy and others had shared with us that Afghans were getting a lot of conflicting information because of how well we'd all done getting Curtis and Mara and others to change process, to improve process. The messaging hadn't quite caught up with that process. So I went to the National Security Council team and I said, hey, could you direct somebody to take inventory of every communication to or about Afghans? Maybe figure out what policy informs that communication, when it was last changed, and make sure they all sort of don't conflict. They all sort of work together. And the White House said, absolutely, we'd love to do that. And CARE got tasked with doing that, and it was a wild success. So we got to take Judy to the National Visa Center, and there were two really special moments during that trip. The first special moment was when we were getting our tour of the National Visa Center. We happened upon the call center, and the call center staff was out there and explaining it to us what they did. Judy asked a question, and because of the sound of her voice, one of the people recognized her. Are you Judy? And there were tears, and she had been on the phone with him for hours and hours and hours for years. And it was so, so incredible. And then the other really special moment was we were having dinner, and Jessica gave Judy a preview of the updated messaging. And Judy cried because those messaging conflicts represented so much heartache, right? We'd gotten through all of the technical issues. People were starting to communicate. Things were happening, but the messaging was so confusing that volunteers would have to tell vulnerable people who were going through the hardest time in their lives, trust us, not the government, on this. And it was really hard. And so the coalition, I think, that's one of our larger wins, is fixing those communications. Another really incredible piece of this ecosystem are how coalition members and other folks across the ecosystem show up for one another, like at the Afghan support centers, right, Layla?
Yeah, so I really feel like the Afghan support centers addressed one of my requests as well from the White House, which was to make sure that Afghans were safe through this process. And so there are physical locations that you can go to all across the country. They are a bridge from the US government to the Afghan people at various cities across the US. But there are a physical place where you can go to where you know that everyone who's there is vetted. It's a vetted organization that has to apply to be there, and they're there to help you with your journey to become an American. So that's everything from your citizenship, your asylum, to citizenship, to getting connected to resources at the local level to help you and your children thrive. But it was to make sure that these predatory folks weren't taking advantage of Afghans, and that was really important to me. And so I walked into one of these centers in Falls Church a few weeks ago, and people were just clapping and they were screaming, and I didn't understand what was going on. And it was actually that someone was standing in front of a US Citizenship and Immigration Services case officer, and in that moment, their asylum had been adjudicated. And so they were allowed to start, onto that pathway of being an American. And I was choking back tears in that moment. It was
Which is not characteristic of our friend Lila.
Okay, I'm dead inside. That's what everyone says. So it was a really big deal that I was super emotional in that moment, because in my mind I was thinking, wow, this is probably what my parents felt, at some point. And it's probably how many other people and their parents or generations previously, what we've all gone through as people who at some point, someone in our family came to this country, and what that must have felt like in that moment to know you were gonna build your American dream here is pretty special.
That's right. So, Curtis, we talked a little bit about the Afghan support centers. Can you tell us a little bit about the resettlement branch?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we're talking here about partnerships, and I think we've talked a lot about the impact that our partnership together has had. But when the Biden administration came into office, we inherited a resettlement infrastructure across the U.S., the infrastructure that resettles both those that come to the U.S. with SIVs and those that come in as refugees, that was significantly degraded. We had people in the government who had been laid off that do this work. Many of the resettlement offices across the U.S., a third of them, in fact, had been closed. So we think about what this felt like. We had 60,000 Afghan allies on our bases domestically and overseas. We needed to get them quickly into new homes, new communities across the US where they could thrive and start their new lives in the United States. And so we needed partnerships within government to break down the silos that made this process slow and inefficient. And we also needed partnerships across the country to expand our capacity. So the resettlement branch that Sean mentioned is an innovation that we came up with within government. And our resettlement process, it includes the State Department, includes the Department of Homeland Security, includes the Department of Health and Human Services. But as you can imagine, if someone's case requires action by one of those three departments, it might linger in someone's email box for a day or two before it gets moved on to the next department. So we said, let's take representatives from each of those three agencies and let's create a branch called the resettlement branch, and they will sit together every day and work through cases and work through issues. And they did, because they could just turn to each other and have snap meetings and help resolve problems. And that really sped up the government's handling of the resettlement process. But like I mentioned, our federal capability to resettle people had been seriously degraded. So we weren't going to be able to replace that capacity overnight. It would take time to bring on more people across the formal resettlement infrastructure. So we partnered with state and local governments. We partnered with veterans groups. We partnered with faith organizations. We partnered with civic organizations and service organizations. And we really saw an outpouring of support from Americans across the country. We saw states like Colorado and Oregon that used their emergency response systems to help provide support for Afghans. We saw cities in Texas that were innovative. We saw cities like Tulsa that welcomed refugees in ways that were really very innovative and revolutionary. And so I think out of this, we all saw that there was this heretofore untapped desire by Americans across the U.S. to help resettle refugees and our Afghan allies.
That's right. And like this photo over here is from San Diego. San Diego County lit up their infrastructure. They stood up an Afghan task force. They did all sorts of stuff. Through the White House partnership with local government, they were doing tangible things. One of the things that we pushed for was show Afghans in your community, show up in the places that they are, give them visual cues that say that you stand with them. And so there's examples like San Diego and Boston and other places around the country that lit up their civic infrastructure in our colors to show Afghans that they stood with them. Speaking of local communities, Lila, there's a lot of good examples of Afghans being welcomed into local communities. So as we talk about outcomes, we moved from people, process, and partnerships into outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about that, about Afghans being welcomed into communities?
Yeah, I think we've talked about it a good bit, in that it's been so amazing to watch how many people who had never really heard of Afghanistan, had never met an Afghan, just really stepped up. And what I'm really proud of is that the veteran community continues to support. Very thankful also to the Afghan American, the Afghan diaspora for really showing up and helping these new Afghans come in. And what's been great to see is that many of these Afghans are thriving. Maybe they don't have the status and the jobs that they had back in Afghanistan, but they're working and they're getting certifications and they're enrolling in colleges and they're moving their lives forward, and they're helping now to support new Afghans that are coming. So the Afghans that came here in 2021 and 2022 and 2023 are now helping other Afghans that are coming. So there's always a desire to pay it back and to pay it forward. And I was just at MIT with these young ladies from the Afghan Girls Robotics team 2 weekends ago, and it was amazing to see that these young girls, when I told them that there was this event going and I invited them to come, they didn't ask me for anything. They got their bus tickets from New York to Boston. They made their Airbnb reservations. Airbnb, what's up? If you want to sponsor too, holler. So it's amazing to see. They've only been here for a few months and they're already just crushing it. So they are here to live their American dream. So proud to see how Afghans are doing today.
That's right, and we have another opportunity for Americans to step up because of the pace of the success that we've had. You all may not know this yet, but there are thousands of Afghans arriving here every month, still. And the resettlement capacity is maybe not enough to accept them as fast as we'd like them. We'd like to be able to accept them more. So we've established something called the Welcome Corps. Curtis, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm glad to. And, you know, there are thousands of Afghans arriving every month, but there's also thousands of other refugees arriving every month. And I think for all of us that had this incredible experience in helping Afghans come to the U.S. and successfully resettle here, we wanted to figure out how do we harness this generosity that we saw in all the trips we did across the country, the bases where we visited, and we saw local community groups that came together to support Afghans. And so the U.S. government has founded something called the Welcome Corps. And this is a program through which 5 Americans, you have to be an adult, but 5 Americans can come together and apply to be sponsors together. And what you really do is you take over the role of the formal resettlement agencies, the formal resettlement infrastructure in the U.S., and you help provide those services yourself. So one person in the group might sign up to help get the kids registered for school before the school year starts. Another might sign up the parents for job training or English lessons, take them to the grocery store for the first time, help them understand how a grocery store works in the United States. And I think, you know, we have been really just touched and impressed by the outpouring of interest we've seen in this. We've had 50,000 people sign up to be sponsors so far since the program launched just last year. So I think this really shows, you know, how we can expand so much beyond the federal resettlement infrastructure just by tapping in to the generosity of Americans. And from the sponsors that we've talked to, we've heard that you know, they get much more out of this than they give, and it's been a really meaningful experience to so many of them.
Absolutely. I talked a little bit about the pace of resettlements picking up. What that looks like is there's thousands of Afghans that are arriving here after going to partner countries to finish up their processing. They get here, they integrate into our communities, and Lila earlier mentioned that Afghans are paying it forward. And you remember my friend Lucky earlier that I talked about? Well, he made it out. He survived. He landed back in San Diego. That last photo was a picture of us welcoming him. He had city council members welcoming him. He had a bunch of Truman members welcoming him. All these folks meeting him at the airport. And he moved to Texas shortly after that. He lives up in Fort Worth. He is a pillar of his community there. He owns the Afghan halal market there. He runs the
Isn't it the Afghan meat shop?
Well, hold on. We'll talk about that. Don't get ahead of me, Curtis. He runs the Afghan halal market in Oklahoma City. I got to visit one of those Afghan support centers, and we walk up to his shop. He's got a flyer for the support center up there. I didn't do that. He's just that into the community there. He's recently established a restaurant that Curtis and I got to go visit called the Afghan Meat Market. Curtis, why don't you tell us a little bit about what that trip meant to you?
So, I mean, first of all, it was just wonderful to see one of our Afghan allies who had set up, you know, a thriving business. He just opened a new branch in Oklahoma. And so that was just great to see in terms of integration and success, you know, in starting a new life in the U.S. But I think what we saw was, you know, a bit of what Lila was saying. You know, we saw his shop in Fort Worth becoming a community center for the Afghan community, particularly those who had newly arrived. So
he even had a barber shop in there. Curtis almost got a haircut.
He did. Thankfully, my hair had just been cut. But, you know, when we first started this work and Afghans were on bases or just really arriving in their communities, we would rely on NGOs and city governments to set up engagements for us. But now, Lucky set up, you know, a delicious Afghan lunch, but also a meeting with, you know, 20 or so members of the community. And it was a chance for me to hear directly what issues they were having there in Fort Worth. They couldn't get their truck driving permit because they didn't have an employment authorization card that was valid, or it was about to expire, or they were having trouble with a family reunification case, trying to bring their daughter to the U.S. And those anecdotes and those stories are invaluable to us in government, because the next morning I got on a plane back to Washington and was able to use those in a meeting with the various U.S. government agencies involved to start to address some of those issues that people were facing.
Well, and our partnership had grown so strong by this point, this was last year, that heads of those agencies, chiefs of staff, the leadership in those agencies started calling me and letting me know that progress was happening. Hey, can we get some more clarity on this? We heard about Curtis's visit. And for me, I mean, Curtis and I have a great relationship, and for me, it's been so wonderful working alongside somebody who I know is doing the right thing, who I know is carrying forward the stories of these folks. What AfghanEvac does...
You kind of won't let me be in peace if I don't, so...
conflict forward. But like, look, the thing that we do so well is we bring reality on the ground past bureaucratic filters and up to folks at the top, like Curtis, like the president, like Mara. And I think, you know, as we have talked about people, process, partnerships, and now some outcomes, before we get into the conclusion, I really want you to take that away, is that here, your voices can be heard at the highest level. Lila, can you tell us, can you wrap us up on the people, process, and partnership piece?
Yeah, just going back to the beginning, it's all about getting a diverse mix of people together, vastly different backgrounds, but I think the key piece is bringing in the people that are the most impacted and elevating their voice, making sure that they are not just in your group, that it's not a token type of environment, that they are leading and that they are really the ones that have the most say in what happens within your coalition or your group process. You got to think about sustainability from the beginning. You have to, because if we keep talking about unprecedented challenges and issues, you know, that are large and at scale, and you can't do that short term, right? With a short term mindset, you got to have some people that think long term. And then the partnerships piece, as we talked about, you can't do it alone. It's not possible for all of you that have an issue or a challenge at your local level. Just be thinking about who else can you partner with. Let go of the egos. Okay, don't worry about who's getting credit for what. Just partner, work together. You're going to make more of an impact. That should be what drives you. It's always the mission, right? It's always the mission. It's what is your goal. And if you can keep that in the focus, then you're going to be able to do great things from the bottom up and with the top down support.
Right. So we've been talking about babies, grandmothers, girls who study robotics, businesses, successful and thriving businesses, all these stories that we've set up nice forms to help people achieve these things, but there's the bureaucratic side, and then there's the actual human side, and these stories are really important to us. And in government too, the intrinsic rewards of succeeding in this project together with our civil society partners matters a lot. So yes, from the bottom, from the ground up, we are intrinsically rewarded by these efforts. And this reaches to the very top. These stories arrive to the top of our leadership. The Secretary of State hears these stories. The President hears these stories. And they want to know that things are going well. They put us on the hook to deliver. So I'll take a pause here, though. I need to honor some other people who've been part of this effort. There's some government colleagues without whom we would never have been able to do these things. CARE, the U.S. government organization at the State Department, CARE, stands on the shoulders of some incredible diplomats who worked under grueling conditions in a task force. We offer them our highest praise and highest thanks. And also, I mentioned at the top that we are at the centerpiece of a broad U.S. government effort. There are so many agencies and dozens and dozens of people involved in this effort. They bring their expertise to resolving all these problems that we've been describing. They too deserve high praise and high thanks. And so CARE is here to stay. We will keep putting our shoulders to the wheel. We will keep working with civil society. We will keep taking feedback. We will keep facing crises. We will keep innovating, and we will keep evolving. We're meeting the moment because we absolutely must.
Thank you, Mayor.
And I think, you know, as Mara said, the government is here to stay, and we're dedicated to this mission. This partnership, the four of us, are dedicated to it. But this is going to be a process that, you know, requires our constant attention. It's not like we've set something up that can now just go forth without any hiccups. And, you know, one of the issues that we're facing is that we've had so much success in terms of speeding up the process that we're actually getting by the end of this fiscal year, we're going to run out of the numbers for special immigrant visas that are authorized by Congress. This has to be authorized specifically by Congress, and it's not something that annually replenishes. So we need a new allotment from Congress, and we've asked for 20,000 in order to carry this work forward.
So I'm a volunteer. I don't work for the government. I'm going to be Curtis's anger translator. Fire me. Look, this really pisses me off. We're on the precipice of all of this work that we've built together, all of this shit that we've been through, all of this shit that our volunteers have been through, all the tears, all of this could all go away because these folks in Congress who claim to support us, who claim to support our wartime allies, who told us, who called me and told me, help get my guy out, we'll be with you, we'll pass laws, we'll take care of you. Listen, I'm a veteran, so I'm used to this, but what we don't need is a pat on the ass, so thank you for your service. What we need is members of Congress to do their jobs, add these visa numbers to the next bill that passes. Don't wait for the perfect bill. We're tired of hearing this like inside game bullshit. Don't wait for the perfect bill. In the next bill that passes, put these visa numbers in there. Support Afghans who served alongside us. It's so important, and for me, we're at a inflection point here of that relationships can change very quickly. And I think that's true for the entire coalition, right? I'm not going anywhere. Judy's not going anywhere. Andy's not going anywhere. Anna's not going anywhere. Ramat, Samad, all of these folks aren't going anywhere. We've been at this for years, and we're going to stay at it. Afghan allies deserve nothing less. So, if you remember nothing else from this conversation, one, go to AfghanEvac.org/elected-officials and call your member of Congress. Call your local government and tell them to call your member of Congress and tell them to add those numbers to the SIV program. Number two, find 4 of your friends and join the Welcome Corps. It is one of the most rewarding things that you can do, is what we hear from sponsors. We've got, actually in the audience today, we've got Nazanin Ash from Welcome.us and Jackie Pilch from Welcome Corps. Welcome Corps is in the room. If you're interested, go talk to them. If anything else, if you don't do either one of those other things, get civically engaged. Use the AfghanEvac recipe to solve other problems in your community that you care about, whether it's a stop sign or whatever it is. Get involved. That's the only way that you're going to make change happen, right? I said earlier, it blew my mind that we were able to get 8 months after January 6th, this cross-section of America together. I thought it was going to last 2 or 3 months. It's still going, and it's stronger than ever. Listen, you heard a lot of good stories today. We've made progress. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of stuff that we talk about. They get calls from me all the time. I fly to D.C., and I show up, and I harass poor Curtis and his staff.
All the time.
All the time.
It's true, all the time.
And I'm not going away. It's too important. Our national security depends on this. Our coalition is dedicated. We're determined. We're not playing around. And I'll tell you, these people represent the best of America. And when I say these people, I mean the coalition. I mean congressional caseworkers, folks that do the same thing the coalition do for members of Congress. Folks in the federal government, everybody, the nonprofits, resettlement agencies, the entire ecosystem of these people are the best of America. They come from all walks of life. They extend their hands. They welcome newcomers into the fabric of our nation. And we're going to keep working together with our government partners and across the coalition. Shana Bashana. Thank you. Thank you. We can take a few questions. We can take one question. We started very strong. Right over here. We'll take 2. Go here first.
We'll take 2.
I'm here, I don't know if this is on. Doesn't matter. I'm here as a civilian because about a month ago I met a man in Alexandria, Virginia, where I'm from, named Nazifullah, who was a translator at the Kabul embassy. He was brought here by the U.S. government. He can't fill out his SIV because he cannot find Morgan Killington, who was his Kabul NX HR rep. And he left his children and his wife, who were hiding from the Taliban. He just needs someone to help him. I volunteer as a citizen. What can he do? You mentioned the DOD can use their records to determine employment.
Thank you for being the kind of citizen you are.
Yes.
First of all, we're very proud to work with people like you. Yes, you can come to AfghanEvac.
Come get my card
we'll
after
guide
this.
you through
We'll
it.
talk. Okay. There you go. Thank you. There's one more question over here.
My English is not very good, but I will try, okay? I'm from Brazil. I've been working with refugees, Afghan ones, since 2 years ago. I have helped them to connect with the companies to work, and I create 2 shelters that I don't name it as shelter because it's a co-living, cool space, and I've received more than 200 people with me, under me, like a mom. It's very grateful. But I have a question, just doing my advertising because it's important. And you know, Brazil is good in opening our frontiers and offering visas for Afghan people. But on the other hand, we are not so good as US to receive them. And most of them, like 6% of the ones that are in Brazil, they are facing the forests. They are going up to Brazil to Acre, and it takes like 4 days in a bus, families. And another day we had like this central bank director with us. They were leaving, and they sleep under the airport. Another day the consul of Romania in Afghanistan, the opposite, and the same. Then when people say, and I get them, I receive, I welcome, and after a while they decide to go to the forest to reach illegally to US. And I mean, what US can do to make, transform their story? Like, I mean, maybe you can offer more visa for those wonderful guys that I love, and it's kind of so crazy because I reach them during their during the forests, and they send me photos. They are alive. We send money, and oh, Luciana, we are in San Diego. I'm very. I saw San Diego. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
And thank you for what you're doing to support refugees in Brazil. I think what you've highlighted is one of the reasons why we have dedicated so much time and effort to make sure that our refugee process and our SIV process are faster. Because think about it, think about how you would feel if you were waiting in Pakistan and you had to wait for 3 years for your refugee case to be processed. You might well decide to take advantage of Brazil's visa policies to try to make this dangerous journey up through the Amazon and to the United States border on your own. But if you know that you could have your refugee case processed in a month, then you'll probably wait for that. So that's one of the reasons why we've invested so much into making this a faster process.
Thank you so much, Curtis. That's all we have time for today, folks. Thank you for coming. We'll be around for a few more minutes.